Welcome, everybody. Beliefs can have consequences. Bad beliefs can have bad consequences. One example, over many centuries, if you fell ill and visited a doctor, and that doctor believed in the venerable age-old tradition of bloodletting, we now know that treatment was more likely to harm you than to heal you. Yet doctors persisted in bloodletting, which means removing blood from a patient's body, often by use of leeches. Doctors applied this treatment for a wide variety of conditions, including tuberculosis, smallpox, scurvy, pneumonia, herpes, gout, diabetes, asthma, and acne. They pointed to a long line of medical authorities who advocated that practice, going all the way back to Cailin in the 2nd century AD and Hippocrates in the 4th century BC. More recently, there are similar controversies over false beliefs on things like whether smoking causes cancer. We might get into some of these controversies in a moment. Bad beliefs can be a matter of life and death, so why do they persist? Why do they sometimes spread so widely, despite their bad consequences? And what action should each of us take to reduce the spread and impact of such beliefs? These are the topics I greatly enjoyed reading about in the book, The Misinformation Age, How False Beliefs Spread, co-authored by Cailin O'Connor and James Weatherall. The book contains some instances of people behaving badly, individually or collectively, but has some inspiring positive examples too. So there is optimism and lots of practical recommendations. We're very fortunate that Cailin joins us today to bring us up to date with the very important research covered in this book. Cailin is a philosopher of biology and behavioral sciences, philosopher of science, and evolutionary game theory. She is professor in the Department of Logic and Philosophy of Science and a member of the Institute for Mathematical Behavioral Science at UC Irvine. Cailin, many thanks for joining us. Welcome to London Futurist. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much for having me. About how long should I go for, David?
I'm willing to give you as long as you like. I will gently butt in if it really has gone on too long. But based on your book, it's all fascinating all the way through. And so
Okay.
I'll happily let you make your own judge if you are setting the scene for a discussion. I prefer a substantial thesis on the table before the conversation gets going.
Okay, great. Well, in that case, I'll share some slides and talk a little bit about some of the research that we write about in this book. So this is a book with James Owen Weatherall. He's another philosopher of science and a colleague of mine. He is also my husband, and we wrote a book together, which amazes a lot of married people. And I will just jump in here. So we start with this little bit from the history of science. So this is a picture of something called the vegetable lamb of Tartary. And in medieval Europe, this rumor started that this was a real creature. So there was a supposed travel diary by this knight that was passed around where the knight claimed to have seen this lamb plant and claimed that he had even eaten these little lambs. So it's supposed to be a plant that has these pods, and if you open it, inside will be a tiny living lamb. And then for the next 400 years, it was believed among learned people and naturalists in Europe that this was real, that there were vegetable lambs of Tartary out in the world. And you can see pictures of them in naturalist textbooks like this. So I think this raises a really interesting question, which is, why would scientists, naturalists, the most educated people in Europe at the time, think that lambs could literally grow on trees? So we're arguably in the middle of a kind of long extended crisis of false belief and misinformation. And this really came on the public scene following the 2016 Trump election, the Brexit vote in the UK, and increasing information that Russia was working on social media to promote false beliefs. Since then, there's been a lot of academic work trying to understand what's going on, what is misinformation, how does it work, how do we fight it, Why are people developing false beliefs as a result of online connectivity? So at the time where we wrote this book, what we saw is that a lot of the explanations of these false beliefs appealed to individual cognitive biases and blind spots. Things like people are bad at understanding probabilities, or people have these reasoning biases. And we thought, well, this is really only part of the story. And the other part, which is maybe more important, comes from our social connections. So for each one of us, most of our beliefs come not from our individual reasoning about the world, but from other people. So if I ask you, how do you know that tomatoes are edible? Or how do you know that the earth goes around the sun? It's not going to be the case that you went out and tested a bunch of vegetables in the world, plants, to see if they were edible. It's not going to be the case that you did a bunch of astronomical measurements to see how the planets work. Someone is going to have told you this. So we pass information from person to person, and this ability is a tremendously powerful resource. So it allows us to develop science and technology. It allows us to have modern medicine, to send people to the moon. But there's kind of a other side to the coin, which is that this social spread of information also allows vegetable lambs to thrive. So the reason you see 400 years of people believing this false, almost absurd belief about the vegetable lamb is that they were passing this information from person to person to person. And for this reason, we argue in this book that if we want to understand false beliefs, how they persist, how they spread, we need to be thinking of belief as a social phenomenon, something that happens in groups of people. And when we do that, it really highlights a set of factors that we'll want to understand when we think about false beliefs. Things like, who do we trust and why do we trust them? What social pressures are we all under when we adopt new beliefs? What people in our social networks are actively trying to mislead us? And how can those propagandists take advantage of our social natures in shaping public belief? So these are some of the questions that we try to grapple with, drawing on work from many, many other people who have addressed these sorts of factors in the spread of belief. And what we do in the book, and a little bit of what I'll talk about here, is make use of two real sources of information. So we draw on a lot of historical cases of false belief. And then we also use mathematical models to try to understand the factors that were at play in these historical cases. So this means that on a computer simulation, we create what you might call an artificial society, where you have individuals who are trying to learn about the world, who are spreading information about the world. And then we ask what happens in these simulations and how can that tell us about the real world? So that's the kind of intro to what we're doing in this project. There are three sort of pull-out units that I took from different parts of this book here. So one on conformity and polarization, one on industry intervention in science, and another on journalism and public belief. So what I'll do is, start with those. And if at some point, David, you're like, all right, time to switch to discussion, just flag me. So conformity. Let's start with another historical episode regarding scientific beliefs. So this is a painting of Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, who was a British aristocrat who lived around the turn of the 18th century. So she traveled to modern day Turkey with her husband, who was a Turkish ambassador from England. She had had smallpox when she was young, and her brother had died of the disease. And when she was in Turkey, she encountered this practice called variolation, which is a bit like modern day vaccination. So what they would do is scratch the arm of a patient, introduce liquid from a smallpox pustule. Then most of the time, the patient would get a milder form of the disease. And after that, they would be immune to smallpox. It was not as safe as vaccination, but given that smallpox could have a 50% death rate, it saved a lot of lives. So when Lady Mary Wortley Montagu returned to England, she wanted to spread this practice, and she tried to do this by informing British physicians about how it worked and getting them to take it up. And what she met was a lot of resistance, a lot of suspicion and hesitation on the part of British physicians. Interestingly, she had a personal physician who had traveled with her in Turkey, seen variolation practiced, had helped perform a variolation on her son, but when he returned to England, he was also hesitant to perform variolations once he was back among his peers. So here we have this situation where you have this life-saving practice. You have people who have gathered knowledge of this life-saving practice and are trying to bring it back to their country. And you see a failure of this good information to spread. So what is going on in a case like this? The famous Ash experiments in the 1950s were psychological experiments that showed that humans have biases towards conformity, and they work like this. So the subject would see some lines like this, and they would be asked which of these lines on the right matches the line on the left. Is it 1, 2, or 3? And then there would be a bunch of confederates of the experimenter who would say the wrong line. So 7 people would go first, and they would all say, I think it's line 3, I think it's line 3, 3, 3. And then the subject would be asked which line it is, and they have to choose, is it the one that obviously matches, oh wait, all right, anyway, all the confederates say the wrong line. Then the subject has to choose, is it the one that obviously matches the one on the left, or is it the one that everyone else said? And what they found in the experiment is about a third of people would go along with what the rest of the group had said, rather than follow their own perceptual evidence. And what that study and many subsequent studies showed is that people are doing this because it's uncomfortable for them to disagree with others in a social group or to stick out from a crowd. So what we ask in this part of the book is, how might this conformist bias influence the flow of information in a social network, and how might it shape scientific beliefs? So we use models to look at what conformity bias will do in a group spreading information. And we find that it tends to make the beliefs of a community worse for a number of reasons. So first, individuals who don't conform, don't pass on, or who conform, don't pass on accurate evidence or information to those in their social network. So this would be like the British physician who knows variolation works, but because he's under the eyes of other physicians, he doesn't pass that information on. Individuals who conform often take actions that don't reflect accurate underlying beliefs. So again, because he's trying to conform with other British physicians, he doesn't variolate people. And that means they also can't learn by watching a variolation and see what happens. And then we also find that conformity can cause stable polarization. So the emergence of subgroups in a society that hold different beliefs, and even though there might be information or communication going between them, these different beliefs are stable because they're all trying to conform with different social groups. So here's just a little janky representation of how this would work. So here we have a network of individuals, and we represent their social ties with these little links between them. Here we picture them all as scientists, because the idea is they're trying to learn about the world. And these purple circles represent some state of belief. So maybe this is a state of belief where they don't know variolation works. So say a discovery is made somewhere. So this individual learns about variolation. Through their social ties, because we have this social spread of knowledge, others they are connected to can adopt this better state of belief. But with conformity, an individual like this, who's already tightly networked with non-believers, might never adopt and pass on this better practice. So we end up arguing that maybe this early case of anti-vaxxing sheds light on some more modern day phenomena, including vaccine skepticism. So one thing we see about anti-vaccine behavior is that anti-vaxxers often tend to cluster in tight-knit communities. So to give a few examples from the US, New Age communities in California, Orthodox Jewish communities in Brooklyn, and Somali American communities in Minneapolis have all been noted as having very high rates of vaccine skepticism. And we think conformity may help explain why more information doesn't always rehabilitate beliefs in these groups. So you have a group of people who all hold similar beliefs, and conformity is helping mutually sort of support and stabilize those beliefs. That's not the only thing going on here, but we do think it's a relevant factor. Now, we also argue in the book that anti-vaccine advocates take advantage of this kind of social structure. So you see groups like Orthodox Jewish communities and Somali American communities being targeted by anti-vaccine advocates. So they're looking for groups that are relatively tight-knit and relatively unconnected to the broader community to try to convince not to vaccinate. Good, so that's the bit on conformity and polarization. Let's talk a little bit about industry intervention in science. So we'll talk about cigarettes. In the 1950s, the magazine Reader's Digest published this influential article called Cancer by the Carton. And this was the most widely read magazine in the world at the time. And it brought forth all this increasing evidence that cigarette smoking caused cancer and other health problems. Around that time, there were a few influential studies showing a very clear connection between cigarette tar and cancer in mice. And after this evidence was shared, cigarette sales started to drop for the first time in decades in the US and elsewhere around the world. So cigarette companies panicked. In the US, 6 major cigarette firms got together and hired a public relation firm, Hills and Knowlton out of New York, to try and combat this increasing consensus that their products were killing their users. And that is just what they did. So the strategy developed by this public relation firm was that for the first time, they were going to fight science with science. They were going to try to use science to convince people that cigarette smoking was safe, or at very least that maybe it wasn't dangerous or the science wasn't settled. And in their book, Merchants of Doubt, which is just really excellent, the historians of science, Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway, go through everything that happened and the way these tobacco firms and this public relation company use science to convince the public of something not true. In addition, these same people, literally the same people, use this strategy to influence policy and public belief regarding nuclear war and strategic defense, the dangers of secondhand smoking, CFCs and ozone depletion, acid rain, and most recently, and perhaps most devastatingly, global climate change. So this is a set of strategies that have been incredibly impactful and have caused major public health issues and concerns. So we talk about these strategies in the book, and part of the reason we think they're very interesting is that the strategies we see and similar methods strikingly often don't involve scientific fraud. So I think that most people understand the corruption of scientific evidence to involve fraud. Something like an industry suit gives a scientist a lot of money and says, produce a study showing that cigarettes are safe, and then the scientist does that. But that's not what happens most of the time. So industry and political groups often don't have to buy or bias individual scientists. Instead, what they do is use different methods to bias the overall body of evidence available to the public. And the ways they do this, they can be subtle, they can be hard to identify, they can be very effective, often more so than outright fraud. So we argue that it's important to understand these and how they work if we want to protect public belief about science. So what we're going to do is talk about 2 of the strategies in the tobacco strategy, which we'll call selective sharing and industrial selection. So selective sharing involves taking real scientific findings that happen to spuriously support industry views and then sharing them widely. So this takes advantage of the way scientific evidence works, because when we're studying something, usually it's a thing where it's hard to know what's true about it. Otherwise, we don't have to study it. And that means that the evidence we gather will often be probabilistic. So some people who smoke get cancer, some people who get cancer didn't smoke. And that means that not every study will point us in the right direction. So industry can take those studies that happen to show the wrong thing and then just really widely communicate them. So we build models where, again, we have a group of people who are trying to learn about the world. We have others who would like to know how something works. Does cigarette smoking cause cancer or not? They can see the evidence produced by the scientists in our model. But there's also another individual we call the propagandist who can take just the spurious findings, just the ones that point in the wrong direction, and share those widely with policymakers and the public. And what we find in this model is that when we don't have this propagandist, the observers always eventually believe what the scientists come to believe, because they're just getting samples of information from the scientific community. That information is drawn from the world. It tends to push them in the right direction. When we add this propagandist, their learning always slows down. And in many cases, it reverses. The public comes to believe something that the scientific community does not believe. So in other words, this is sort of a proof of purpose that just sharing this real, independently produced data can be completely misleading to the public. And in particular, we find there are some things that make this harder or easier. So when our scientists run studies of high quality, in particular ones where they gather a lot of samples of the world, it's harder for the propagandist to confuse the public because there are fewer studies that are going to be misleading. There are fewer things that the propagandist can weaponize. So in this kind of regime, a bad scientific study is almost like an arrow in the quiver of industry propaganda. So here's a weird takeaway. Just because a scientific finding is real, and when I say real, I mean it's gathered by real scientists using ideal methods who are in no way influenced by industry, doesn't mean it isn't misinformation. The context for how it's shared and how it's used decides whether or not something is or isn't misinformation. And we saw the use of a lot of real studies that just didn't find a link, say, between mice and cancer, acting as misinformation when we look back at this historical episode. All right, so the second strategy I'll talk about is called industrial selection. So this is something a little different. So the first strategy, and this was introduced by two philosophers of science, Bennett Holman and Justin Bruner. So the first strategy we looked at was one where scientists are working independently, and then industry is taking their findings and sharing them in various ways. This is a strategy where industry is going to shape what actually gets produced in science, but not in ways that corrupt scientists. So what industrial selection involves is funding scientists who are already using methods favorable to industry findings. So it's usually the case that scientists aren't all the same. They hold different background beliefs, they look at different study populations, they use different methods. And what this will mean is that some scientific studies will be more likely to gather accurate information about the world than others. And what industrial agents can do is find those people who are using the worst methods, or rather the ones that are favorable to some industry claim, and give them money. And when they give them money, those people are able to produce more studies, share more studies, train more students, hold conferences. And in this way, the body of evidence produced can be pushed in the wrong direction, even though each individual scientist keeps doing exactly what they would have done, even if industry hadn't been involved. So they're not committing fraud. So they give this great example in their work regarding antiarrhythmic drugs. So in the 70s, these drugs were developed because it was noticed that arrhythmias often precede heart attacks. And then they were studied to see whether it would be a good idea to prescribe them widely. And some scientists asked this question. They asked, do antiarrhythmic drugs prevent premature death? Other scientists were asking the question, do antiarrhythmic drugs stop arrhythmias? And industry tended to fund just scientists in the latter camp who were asking, do these drugs stop arrhythmias? And indeed, they did stop arrhythmias. So on the basis of this research, the drugs were manufactured and sold. But And you may be anticipating where this is going. They, in fact, did not stop premature deaths. They caused premature deaths. So the drugs increased the chances that subjects would die of heart attacks. And it took quite a while to figure this out. And so some people have estimated that upwards of 100,000 people may have died because they were taking these antiarrhythmic drugs. So again, this is a situation where industry is just shaping science by funding certain people. They're not asking those people to commit fraud or change their studies. They're just giving their funds to the people who are most likely to find the thing that industry wants. So the big kind of takeaway here, industry influence can be tricky and subtle. It often takes advantages of the norms and social structures of scientific communities. So scientists are humans living in a community. It's often the case that scientists do not want to commit fraud because that would be quite bad for them if it was discovered. It's ethically wrong, but also, you can be a pariah if it's discovered that you commit fraud in science. And so it's more effective in many cases for industry to influence science without requiring scientists to commit fraud. And we think that all of this can lead us to misdiagnose the presence and strength of industry influence on our scientific beliefs. And just to give one more little example, so in sort of the mid-20th century, there was this debate about whether sugar or fat was the primary cause of heart disease. And you see the sugar industry funding the people who think that fat is the main cause, and they're giving those people money to do more studies. Subsequently, folks have looked at this history and argued, well, those people were already on the trail of fat. They already thought fat was the cause. And so this is an instance where there wasn't something bad going on. The science that was getting done was the same science it would have been. But we have subsequently argued, well, that could very well be industrial selection because sugar is choosing who's getting the money. Okay. So that's it for industrial intervention. If we like, I can talk about journalism.
Yes, please.
Okay, let's do it.
Also a lot of practical recommendations in here.
Yeah. Okay, so this is the last bit. So this tobacco strategy that we've been talking about, it involves biasing the evidence seen by the public, either by sharing just some evidence or shaping what evidence gets created in the first place. And so the public sees evidence, scientific evidence in some arena that's different from how it might have been if industry wasn't involved. One thing we argue is that given the effectiveness of this strategy, we want to think about other ways that science is curated for the public. So it's never the case that all of us just see everything happening in science. What would that even mean? There's just so much research being done. We see curated sets of it. And that curation is going to shape what we come to believe. So one group we look at are journalists, whose job includes communicating facts and scientific results to the public. And we talk about some of the norms and rules that journalists follow and how these are going to shape the curation of science. So one is fairness norms. So in the US, until 1987, there was an explicit law that required broadcast license holders to present controversial issues in a fair manner. And in practice, that meant that different sides of a controversy would be given equal airtime, or if we're translating this to print, equal amounts of space or the same number of editorials. And this was true even in cases such as over the health risks of tobacco, where you have two sides and one has overwhelming evidence compared to the other. So it was also, fairness was being applied in scientific cases. So today this rule is gone, but the both sides ethos is very common still in journalism and reporting. And it's been widely argued that this ethos has been applied in the case of climate change to great harm, where people will treat climate change activists and climate change deniers as if they are sort of equal sides of a debate, when in fact one side has all the evidence. So what we did is built a model where we looked at a community, again, of scientists trying to find out about the world, members of the public or policymakers who want to know about the science, And now we consider a journalist who can share information from the scientific community using different strategies. And what we find is, paradoxically, if this journalist reports fairly, it leads to dependably worse beliefs in this model. So the journalist could randomly select information from that community to share, just randomly pick studies, or they could always try to pick one study in favor and one against some phenomenon, and the latter does worse. And the reason is, when they use this fairness strategy, the journalists are systematically overweighting evidence for worse beliefs. Because on average, the evidence in the community is going to tend to support better beliefs. There will be more studies showing climate change is real. So when you're giving equal weight to both sides, you're always propping up the worst one. And what we argue is that a more fair strategy will involve surveying and then reporting on the entire body of evidence in a literature, rather than, sort of picking out individual things and trying to be fair. So a takeaway here, even unbiased journalists who are adopting industry best practices can promote false beliefs. Fairness is one mechanism by which this can happen, but there are others. So one is novelty bias, which reflects the fact that humans tend to be highly interested in new, surprising findings. This means that journalists tend to share new, surprising findings, but often, if a finding is very surprising, that's because it's wrong. It doesn't fit in with the set of beliefs we already hold. Another mechanism involves reporting on the existence of false claims or findings. So this is a little bit of a tricky thing, because it often is news that there was some false claim or some false scientific result, or someone said something that wasn't true. But sometimes when people report on that, it creates a vegetable lamb. So say, the report is something like, X politician says climate change is false. Well, that is a true statement, but many people will just hear climate change is false. And then another thing we talk about is single study reporting. So as we've been discussing, evidence in the scientific community is probabilistic. And what this means is that individual studies can be, and often are, misleading. And when you're forming your beliefs about science, what you want to do is look at the broadest set of evidence you can from the scientific community and try to get, a good and reasonable set of beliefs on the basis of that broad evidence, rather than single studies. So I'll give one example to really drive that home. Here's an online article about a scientific study. Science says a glass of red wine can replace 1 hour of exercising. Are you a red wine drinker? What if I tell you sipping a glass of wine can equate to an hour of exercise? Yep, it's tried and tested. A new scientific study has just confirmed this wonderful news. So here's a report on the basis of one scientific study. There's a lot going wrong here. In fact, if you go and read that study, nobody was drinking any wine or exercising. It was a bunch of hamsters who were being fed resveratrol and then going on treadmills. But this is the kind of reporting you don't want to see. It's not based on a wide literature. If you looked at that wide literature, it would confirm that wine shortens your lifespan on average. All right. So you'll notice that in this talk, I've talked a lot about history, but not much about special features of current internet misinformation and disinformation. But I think a lot of the lessons we learn apply to things that are happening now. So social media gives new opportunities for conformist bias to influence us, especially when we're selecting and curating our own social networks. So we're going to say Russia can take advantage, but Russia is just a stand-in there for the many, many propagandist groups who are trying to influence public belief on the internet. So they can, for example, create sock puppets, fake groups, fake agents who look like the kind of people we would want to conform to. And then when we try to conform to those people, we are influenced by whatever those propagandists are trying to do. Social media changes our social networks, and it gives propagandists new direct connections with the public. So in an age of traditional media, if you're a propagandist trying to communicate with people, there are many fewer ways to do that. Maybe you can create pamphlets that you send around. Maybe you can convince doctors to tell their patients certain things, but you can't just get online and directly hook up with millions and billions of people via social media. And a last takeaway I would say is that none of us should assume we know what misinformation and disinformation looks like. So what we saw with the tobacco strategy and what we also see with like the science of misinformation now is that misinformation and disinformation are often tricky, subtle, weird. They're often taking forms that we wouldn't expect. We can talk more about that in Q&A as well. There's a lot of incentive for people to misinform us. And so in general, we need to be careful because we may or may not be savvy about the techniques being used to shape public belief. With that, I will say thank you.
Thank you very much. That was a great survey of what I see as very important ideas. I mean, the world, as I said at the beginning, is heavily influenced by false beliefs. It's causing people to do bad things. All of us are in various ways sometimes victims of these false beliefs, directly because we believe things that we shouldn't believe, or indirectly because other people in society are believing these things and causing harm. Sometimes we are also ourselves unwittingly the purveyors of false beliefs because we act as journalists. I mean, I'm not a journalist, but I do blog, I organize events, and if I'm not careful, I may give too much credence to an interesting view without reflecting properly the full breadth. So I think all of this is fascinating, and I'm particularly interested in the notion that things that are individually rational for individuals, given all that they know, add up often to collective irrationality, things that are not the best choice for that group or for society. So we have to take that social perspective into account. And it transcends things that you said, like fraud. Not all misinformation involves fraud. It doesn't all involve people having psychological defects. It's often people doing what is rational in their circumstances. So that brings us back to the recommendations of what we should be doing differently. So let's start off with a question from Paul Imrie, which is one that I've often wondered myself, which is, do we need new laws or penalties for spreading bad stuff if people are deliberately spreading falsehoods, or if they are being careless? And should they be more attentive? Should they be penalized, or is that the mark of a totalitarian state which at all costs we want to avoid?
Yeah, this is so tricky because as soon as you're talking about like how do we prevent misinformation and disinformation, you're talking about in some ways controlling or shaping speech, being active about the ways we shape variations of speech. And in doing that, obviously, we have to be extremely careful because there are really serious harms that can follow on from trying to control public speech. Now, this said, I think there are a lot of creative ways that we can use regulation to clean up our informational environments without impinging all that much on individual freedoms. So people talk about social media algorithms a lot. Algorithms are shaped in all sorts of ways for all sorts of reasons. Nobody's entitled to have what they post promoted by an algorithm. So one thing we can do is try to deplatform the worst offenders when it comes to misinformation and disinformation. And especially online, a lot of the worst content is coming from a small number of individuals, and they're having this disproportionate impact on how accurate information is on these platforms. And so I think it's perfectly fine to use like creative and ever-evolving rules to try to decrease the impact of that sort of stuff. And then you don't have to throw people in jail. I also do think a lot of online platforms should have basically opt-in user agreements that say something like, if I'm going to be on this platform, I agree to do my very best to share accurate content and information and not share misleading content and information. And then there's a way to sort of kick people out of there who are purposefully spreading disinformation, because you've already said from the beginning, this is the kind of thing we're doing on this platform. We're being accurate and not being misleading.
So what about the case when people are spreading false beliefs, not because they actually believe in them, but because they gain clicks, they gain reputation? In some case, they make a lot of money. It's alleged that somebody like the American publicist Alex Jones He has things that he advocates, not because he personally believes them, but he makes a lot of money out of the associated advertising clicks. Is that something we can address as well?
Yeah, I think, again, people like that can be deplatformed as much as possible from things like social media sites. But I also think that probably what most governments need is some kind of flexible regulatory bodies, the kind of bodies that most people already have to look at things like food safety, or, a lot of people have something like the FCC in the US that looks at media content, but that can, so misinformation and disinformation are always evolving. There's always new stuff. And there are always people like Alex Jones who have some kind of incentive to share misinformation, either to get attention or because they have some bottom line they're trying to promote. What we want are regulatory bodies that can flexibly respond. And in these cases, think about what are the best ways to protect free speech while also decreasing the harmful impacts of people like Alex Jones or other more explicit propaganda bodies.
Now, another recommendation is that we should be wary of giving too much attention to small sample studies, that there might be the occasional results, which because, well, one thing, there's a publication pressure, isn't there? All scientists are evaluated on how often they publish, which is deemed nowadays often to be controversial, but its incentive is there. So people are trying hard in multiple ways to find something that passes the criteria for publication, but then once it's out there, it can then be picked up by journalists looking for something exciting. So is there something that the science bodies themselves can be doing to recommend against this small threshold publishing?
Yeah, good. So because both Jim and I are philosophers of science, this is our area of study. This is something that we've thought a lot about and that a lot of people across the scientists have been grappling with recently. And the usual way we talk about it is that the incentive structures of science are set up in such a way that what you want to do is publish, and that may or may not overlap with creating the most accurate information and spreading the most accurate information. And this hooks up with this idea that often the studies that get publicized are the ones that are wrong because they're surprising and shocking. So there are these incentives for scientists not to put all the time they could into developing a finding because you need to publish it and you want to get attention. There are also incentives to share your work earlier before it's well vetted. During the COVID-19 pandemic, I'll point out this created enormous problems. So there was all of this pressure and incentive to create new information about COVID. And this meant that a lot of scientists were rushing through studies. A lot of people were posting things on preprint servers before they had been peer reviewed. And a lot of journalists were picking up these preprint studies and widely publicizing them. And then it happened again and again and again that there were these findings that were spread all over the place and ended up being wrong just because they hadn't been checked yet. So this really causes problems. So what can we do? What a lot of people advocate for is trying to rework incentives in science so that there are stronger incentives to just do fewer, better studies. But this is very hard to do because, of course, you don't get famous by doing just a small number of studies necessarily. Some things that people talk about are, for example, shaping tenure and promotion so that scientists are more incentivized to do higher quality work.
And on this point, are you an advocate for peer review? I noticed people pointing out that Einstein's papers generally weren't peer reviewed, that many of the most fundamental and valuable papers in the history of science weren't peer reviewed. Peer reviewed imposes its own restrictions and limitations.
I am an advocate for peer review. I don't think that we should use Einstein as like a paradigmatic example of how most people can do good science. That was quite an exceptional case. Peer review is very important for checking and verifying the quality of academic work.
Right. Question from Gordon Silverman, who points out that you've given historical examples of misinformation. Misinformation, it seems, is part of the history of our culture, our evolution. Is continued misinformation an inevitability? It's something that is going to follow us around? Or is it that misinformation is going to change its nature, as you've suggested?
Good. I do think misinformation is an inevitability in human societies. And I like to think of the social spread of misinformation as like opening a door. So when we open this door, good information can go through, bad information can also go through. So we've opened these channels between us. We're not always going to share the good stuff. And you see this in every society at every time in history. So we're not going to avoid misinformation. Our goal is to minimize it, to, when we have these channels open, make as much of the information coming through accurate or useful and as little misleading and harmful as possible. And there's a lot of different ways we can do that. So if we look at the history of media, when there are new media forms, you always see proliferation of different types of misinformation in these new media forms, and then society responding in ways to protect them. So, you know, there's the creation of radio, and then a bunch of people make their own like sort of radio stations that are saying all sorts of wacky news stuff. And then the government regulates the radio so that they are no longer able to reach many members of the public. So we have that kind of thing, ways to respond. That doesn't mean that modern technology isn't in some ways changing what's going on with misinformation. And I think the most salient thing here is that the speed of development of new media has increased dramatically. So it used to be that it was very rare that there were technological innovations that really shaped the way information could flow between people. But now we have these innovations happening constantly. There's always new media platforms that have different formats that mean information can flow in different ways. And I think that makes it hard because we don't sort of have the cultural time to respond to what's going wrong and regulate in a new way. So somehow we need to speed up our rate of response and regulation to misinformation in these new formats for sharing.
The natural response follow-up to that is the question which happens to be at the top of the list now. It's by Alan Bolton. It's got the most votes. He points out that AI automation has got the ability to generate volumes of very believable misinformation. It also has the ability to personalize information flows. So instead of giving a blanket piece of misinformation that many of us will shrug off, it can work its way into each of our minds. How worried are you about this? And do you have any recommendations for dealing with it?
Yeah, I mean, this is, it's not something that I've thought a lot about, like the ways that AI created misinformation specifically is going to be more problematic than human created misinformation. So I think that when we think about responding, there's a kind of general picture that I think holds for AI misinformation in the same way as any other type. And the general picture is that misinformation and disinformation will keep evolving and changing. So it's not like we're going to set up some set of regulations or practices or algorithmic filters that are going to solve the misinformation problem. Because if we do that, then the various people who have an incentive to misinform the public are going to say, well, here's what the regulations are like now. How do we get around them? And we see this happening all the time. You know, an algorithm has some way to detect bots, and then people create new bots that are undetectable by that algorithm. And then Twitter has to make another algorithm that can detect the new bots back and forth. So I think basically with AI misinformation, the picture will have to be the same, that the people who have incentives to keep online platforms healthy as good informational sites will have to use the same sorts of techniques to fight AI misinformation.
Question by PNJ brings us back to basics. We've been talking about better beliefs and worse beliefs. What do we mean by this? Is this just imposition of a white man's culture, or is there something more fundamental about our attribution of some beliefs as dangerous and others as not dangerous?
Yeah, this is a great question. And as someone who works in philosophy, it's something that's like is very present in philosophical discourse. So in the work that I've done and that Jim and I have done, what we do is take what you might call a pragmatic approach to thinking about truth, where we say a good belief is one that allows you to act effectively in the world. So if I believe that a poisonous mushroom is safe to eat, it's a bad belief because it doesn't allow me to meet my own goals in the world. And my goal is to eat and survive, right? If I believe that climate change isn't happening, it's a bad belief because one of my goals is to create a world where my children can survive and thrive. And so I'm not able to meet my goals holding that belief. Now, notice that these kinds of like pragmatic good or bad beliefs, that's not exactly the same as like capital T truth in some grand underlying way, but it does allow us like to distinguish in a pretty effective way between the sorts of beliefs that we see spreading that are going to be harmful or misleading and the ones that aren't.
As you say in the book, you're not proposing to solve the problem of induction, this famous question of how we can infer a regularity that can't be deduced from the data, but you're proposing to be able to sideline it. We shouldn't demand exact standards of truth before we take an action. And you gave a fascinating example. Maybe you could explain it some more about the resistance to CFC bans, when there was some evidence that CFCs, the chemicals in deodorants and refrigeration, might be damaging the ozone layer. And various chemical companies whose businesses might, at least in the short term, be impacted by such a ban, complained and said, well, we don't know for sure.
That's right. So often when we talk about belief, we talk about it as if we have it or don't. And we think that's not a great way to think about our beliefs because usually you are more or less sure about different things. Like I am very, very sure the sun is going to go down tonight. I am less sure about whether the fish I'm eating has mercury and whether that might be bad for me. So we have these ranges of beliefs from, very strong to weaker confidence. And what we argue is that in a certain case, in order to act, it's not like we need to have full confidence in our beliefs to act. We don't usually have full confidence. We usually are just pretty sure about something, and then we're able to take the actions that would make the most sense with that. So one thing you see a lot with industry propaganda is people taking advantage of this idea that you need to really know something before you act on it, saying something like, well, climate change is just a theory, or it might not be CFCs destroying the ozone layer. But of course, for public policy and all of our decision making, we don't need to have full certainty in any of these things. We just need to have a good degree of confidence, and then we act in a reasonable way to protect ourselves from what seems to be a threat on our best evidence and belief.
I probably mischaracterizing this. Something you said sounded like good belief is something that will help you progress with your goals. Terry Raby points out that for some people, belief like Pizzagate, that there was terrible things happening in basements of pizzas funded by Hillary Clinton and others, such a belief is actually helpful for many people. Similarly, people may espouse creationism as opposed to evolutionism, and that is helpful for them in their social circumstances. So again, I ask you, how do we distinguish good and bad beliefs?
So there's two things I'd want to pull apart here. One is that there are some scientific beliefs that just don't really matter to how we behave. So being a creationist isn't going to hurt you in any way. There aren't day-to-day actions you're going to take that are going to be bad for you or anyone else because you're a creationist. And I think there's a lot of false beliefs like that. If you drink some kind of mushroom tea that doesn't have any health benefits, but it doesn't have health detriments, who cares? Like, go ahead and drink that mushroom tea. And those false beliefs aren't going to hurt you. Now, there's another thing here that I think is different and very important to talk about, which is that sometimes holding false beliefs it's not that it gets you good things in the world, it's that it gets you good things from your social community. And there's a lot of cases where people get social payoffs by believing something false. And we might want to say something like, it's not even irrational for them to believe or espouse this thing because they're getting these very clear benefits from doing it. And something like Pizzagate can play that kind of role. And so in a situation like that, there's some sense in which for some people it is good for them to believe something false because of these social payoffs they're getting. What I would want to pull apart in those cases is how these beliefs then shape their interactions with the kind of structure of the world rather than their social structure. So believing in Pizzagate for the guy who went and shot up Cosmic Pizza and got locked in jail ended up being, a harmful belief.
The question on the top of the list now is by Michael Harrison, who points out that when you come across someone in your network who is believing and spreading misinformation, and you directly challenge that belief, often by sharing peer-reviewed evidence, that it sometimes leads to the individual doubling down on their position. So it seems to be counterproductive. So can you recommend more effective strategies to help people in some cases to change their minds?
Yeah, and this is something that people all over the world are really grappling with these days. A lot of people have a beloved uncle who has gone down the QAnon rabbit hole or something like that. So there's some kinds of beliefs where this doubling down doesn't happen. So there are a lot of beliefs that we hold that don't have anything to do with our social or political identity, that we're not really entrenched on. So one day you hear like, oh, lycopene in tomatoes is good for cancer. And the next day someone's like, it turns out that wasn't true. And it's not like you're holding on to that lycopene belief. So what we're really talking about here are a special set of beliefs, usually the ones that are polarized and usually the ones that have come to be part of people's political, social, personal identity. So in various places, these might be vaccine-related beliefs, they might be gun control related beliefs, abortion-related beliefs, Brexit-related beliefs, things that have these political relevance. And part of what's going on is that when you're just sharing information, it might not change someone's mind because there's other reasons that they hold these beliefs and meta reasons why they don't trust people with different ones. So one thing I will say is that changing minds in these situations is just extremely difficult. There's a reason people keep asking about this and being frustrated by it, because it's just not easy to do. I can't give an easy answer to save your QAnon uncle. But I will say getting angry or treating people like they're stupid, we know that doesn't work. Drawing personal connections with other people can be helpful. So you're skeptical of this vaccine. I think you want to protect your kid. And I understand that because I often am afraid of how various things, including medical things, may harm my kid. That's a way you can connect with people who hold different beliefs and just, draw a kind of bridge of trust. Another thing is that some people think works is sharing personal stories about why you believe something that's true. So even though I have this fear about my kids, I've looked at different literature, I've talked to doctors, I trust doctors for these reasons. And so that's why I decided to vaccinate. So all of these things are about sort of creating a bridge of trust and using that bridge of trust and narratives to shape people's thoughts or encourage them to think further on some topic. But as I said, this may or may not work, and in many cases, it probably won't.
On this point, I want to recommend that people read your book, of course, because it's full of fascinating insights, but I will mention a book by Adam Grant called Think Again. He's a psychology professor, I forget where, but his book is full of recommendations as to how to help people change their minds. He has a discussion of the so-called vaccine whisperers, which is ways in which some people's vaccine hesitancy can gradually be addressed, but not by shouting at them, more by whispering, as you suggest. So he talks about expressing personal respect rather than just saying, I know what's best for you, you've got to do it. It's more a matter, well, I'm sure you will take the right decision for yourself. Asking questions rather than lecturing, and finding a middle ground, finding that the world isn't quite neatly divided into black and white, that there are issues which complicate the landscape. And although we often want to simplify, we always want to say, here's a clear structure. Sometimes in reality, it's better to point out the ambiguities, and that can also motivate people. So sorry for that long distraction. Perhaps what we've just discussed goes some way to answering a question that Mary Fee has raised, who points out that she mixes with a lot of activists in the UK, and she says she's noticed that more and more of them are questioning things that personally she takes for granted. They're questioning whether COVID exists. They're questioning the value of vaccination, saying injections are killing people. They seem to be increasingly questioning climate change, talking about chemtrails from aeroplanes. In the YouTube chat, I see Candidate said there, a lot of people seem to be driven to these beliefs by fear and by turbulence and uncertainty. So have you anything more to say as to why there might be a growing prevalence? Or maybe it's not growing prevalence, it's just an individual variation.
So there certainly, I think, is evidence that in the age of social media, certain kinds of false beliefs seem to be more prevalent and more impactful on certain parts of our social system than they were shortly before. My sense is that that's what a lot of what's probably going on in this activist community as well as other communities. I don't know that much about activists specifically, but part of what Murray was talking about were conspiracy theories, and conspiracy theories have been able to flourish and spread in these online spaces. I think part of what's going on there is that, I talked about conformity in the talk and social pressures for belief. And historically, when we didn't have online spaces, if you were a conspiracy theorist, it was relatively hard to find other people who held the same wacky false beliefs that you held and to conform with them and to have a social space with them. Now that's pretty easy to do. All the flat earthers can communicate with each other very well. They can share flat earth evidence with each other. They can, pat each other on the back that they've figured out the truth. And so I think there are these online spaces that allow people to conform with each other, to get social feedback that's positive, and to hold really, sometimes wild and harmful beliefs.
So a couple of questions about, can we have mechanisms to assess the trustworthiness of scientists or journalists? So Paul Imre, do we need some kind of scores for scientists who people spread info? He refers to something called Trustpilot. I'm not sure how widespread that is, but in the UK, you can assess the work of handymen, plumbers, and so on as to, well, this is good. So, but then Alan Boltman asks, following on from that, well, what are the basic components of any such trustworthiness score? How would we build it up rather than just saying, I like him or whatever?
Mm-hmm. So I think that we already see this to some degree with media sources, and that's a really good place to apply this kind of ranking. And then there's very clear things that you would want from a media source, that it's not sharing a lot of falsehoods, that generally it's giving a well-contextualized view of some issue when it discusses it. And so I think that is something that's already out there for media and is a very good idea. As far as individual scientists, I think that gets a lot trickier. Fraud is relatively rare in science. It's not that it never happens, but there isn't a lot of fraud because most incentives in science do push against it. I mean, there's some degree to publish quickly and get a lot of attention, but people who are caught get these very terrible social punishments. I do think in general, we should promote incentives in science that decrease desire to do untrustworthy things, but having individual scores for individual scientists, I wouldn't think that would be a particularly effective way to go about improving trust, the public belief. I also think most members of the public don't know individual scientists and don't know their work, right? So it's not like they're like, oh, I saw this thing by X biologist, and I looked at that biologist trustworthiness score, and that helped me assess it. It's more like they see things that are spread by different media sources about science.
The importance of diversity in science, not just that all scientists are always influenced by each other's results and theories. The book has a fascinating example of the causes of ulcers, whether ulcers were caused by acid in the stomach or caused by bacteria infections. And you basically said in some cases it's better if not all scientists are influenced by each other's results, and we should encourage reasonable diversity of approaches and encourage people to try and kick the tires of established theories.
Yeah, so this is something that, so a student of mine, Jingyi Wu, and I have recently really been grappling a lot with. And, we're drawing on work from a lot of different philosophers of science, including Kevin Zollman, who we talk about in the book, but also a lot of feminist philosophers of science, where, and this is an argument that's gone back quite long in the history of people thinking about the workings of science, which is something like, you don't want everyone in science to be the same, and you definitely don't want them all to hold the same beliefs. Now, at some point, if there's enough evidence on some topic that it becomes overwhelming, then you want everyone to hold the same beliefs. So about climate change, I don't want any more climate change deniers. It's clear climate change is happening, right? Everyone can just hold the same belief. But usually in science, there's going to be some period of time where there's genuine uncertainty about what's true. And during that period, you want people who might be a little stubborn, who might have different backgrounds from other people, who might, for whatever reason, not be conforming and following the herd to a new theory, to make sure that you spend enough time testing many different theories and finding the best one.
So it's a few years since your book was published. Are you still working on similar ideas, or is there anything else you'd like to say about what your research now involves?
Yeah, so we've continued on with this general project. So I've got a grant and students and people, and we do some more of this modeling work. We've moved on to sort of different topics than those just covered in the book. We've looked much more at journalism and media and how journalistic norms promote the spread of false beliefs. We've thought a lot about retracting scientific information. So this was very relevant during the pandemic for this reason I described, that kind of half-vetted information was being spread really quickly and then retracted. And one thing you often see is that it's very hard to retract information. You can't successfully do it a lot of the time. So we've modeled that process and thought about that. We've been thinking a lot about the ways different ideas connect to each other. So, we all have these networks of interconnected beliefs where if I change my belief about whether it's cloudy, that also changes my belief about whether it's going to rain, and that changes my belief about whether it will be safe to drive, and that change, so these ways that our beliefs influence each other. And we've been thinking a lot about how we might use those influences to unstick cases of polarization. So if you and I disagree about vaccines, we might still agree about the dangers of measles. So I might try to get you to vaccinate, not by being like, look, this vaccine is safe, but rather saying something like, I want you to understand how harmful measles can be to a young child, how great the dangers are. So instead of attacking a polarized belief, attacking related beliefs where you might have some more flexibility or shared trust with people. That's just
what are the prospects for new journalistic norms or improved journalistic norms, given that there's a wide spectrum of online publications and online and TV channels these days? Once upon a time, all the main TV channels had gatekeepers who wanted to verify that what was shared had some validity. And they would sometimes say, well, this is too good to be true. And, if the story is, you can't publish it just because of that. You have to still nevertheless investigate it. Whereas nowadays, there are more and more sites that seem to be happy to publish things for all kinds of reasons, to accelerate their visibility, to cause social chaos, perhaps. So what prospects are there for journalistic norms having a real effect in the world?
It's very hard to say. I mean, right. So part of what we've thought about is like, what would be the best way to publish as a journalist? But the state of media is so far away from that for this reason that you described, that there's just this proliferation of low quality, fast online news sources. And unless we can move back to a model where you have these high quality, slow, well-vetted news sources being the most impactful and the most widely read, I don't think there are great prospects for promoting good norms and for those having a good impact on public belief. I do think that this is probably a situation where, regulations of various sorts would be helpful and would be a good idea, though it's hard to know how you would do them without like harming free speech. But for example, moving back, so I criticized the fairness doctrine when it comes to scientific information, but moving back to some kind of model where you can't have highly partisan news sources might be a first step.
We do have regulation that works in some areas of public communications. Adverts are subject to advertising principles. If you say certain things, you can be challenged in your advert and you can be fined. If you make statements about your company's financial circumstances which are not well founded, again, you can be in trouble. Or if you leak information at the wrong time, insider trading. So it seems there is some prospect here, but most countries are frightened of mandating things that might have political overtones. Are there places where you see things working better, perhaps, than in the US and the UK? Are there other places in the world that may be doing this better?
Yeah, who's doing it well? Honestly, I'm not sure because I've spent so much time looking at who's doing it poorly. I can tell you who's not doing it well. It's like Brazil, quite bad. China, really terrible.
All right, so it's 1:30, and I'm going to give you a chance in a moment, Cailin, to give any concluding remarks if there are things that you think our audience should have in their minds as they wind up. I'll also say we are going to allow a few people to hang around, and we'll break into a little debrief, an informal chat. Now, Cailin, I want to thank you so much for putting these very important topics on the table. I want to encourage people to track down your book and read it. We've covered, I don't know, at a certain level, maybe a third of the ideas in the book, but there are plenty of other really moving, profound examples. Some of them make you angry when you think these people have done terrible things, but others are inspirational. Actually, people with our human foibles nevertheless managed to get this right. So what are your concluding remarks?
Yeah, so I guess if there's one more thing I would want to communicate that hasn't really come up yet, we talked a bit about like, what do you do personally with those in your life who hold false beliefs? But if I were thinking myself, like, what is the most impactful way that I can, change the state of misinformation and disinformation? It has to be about larger centralized changes. It has to be about governments caring about this, regulating it, having these flexible regulatory bodies, about social media platforms taking it seriously. So what I advocate for people who ask, like, oh, what can I do to be better about sharing misinformation? Like, great for you to learn more about misinformation, but the most important things you can do are make clear to politicians that this is something that matters and is really harmful and threatening to our democracies. It really is. And to try to elect people who care about truth and true beliefs in science and are going to, implement policies that are guided by our best understandings of the world.
The route to a better future inevitably involves better politics. Individual actions are important, but political change can make a huge difference. In the UK, there is a bill going through Parliament called the Online Harms Act, which is pretty controversial because lots of different activist groups, lots of different pressure groups are shoehorning their own ideas into this bill, so it's received a lot of controversy, but I think that's the kind of discussion we need to have, and we may not get the act entirely right first time round, but having an act in place is probably better than just leaving it as the status quo. And all the people who are working on that bill probably should read your book. Thanks very much, and I'm going to shut down the recording now, and I'll see a few of you after a 5 or 10 minute break. Thanks so much, Cailin.
Thank you.